That creek is HOA property now.
The HOA buried my 70-year-old creek and piped it into their storm sewer. 48 hours later, one hard rain flooded 23 yards and shut down their $186,000 park. What they didn't know was that I had the 1954 survey, the recorded watercourse maps, and 31 years of civil drainage experience. If you like watching bullies lose to paperwork, subscribe. Because the deeper I dug, the more expensive their mistake became. At 7:18 that morning, I heard a diesel excavator behind my equipment shed. I knew the sound immediately. After 3 decades around drainage projects, you learn the difference between a machine moving dirt and a machine cutting grade. This one was cutting. By the time I reached the south fence, Millstone Creek was gone. Not dry. Gone. For more than 70 years, the creek had followed the same shallow channel across the western edge of my property. That morning, nearly 180 feet of it had been filled with compacted soil. A contractor had cut a new trench toward the subdivision, installed a 30-inch pipe, and redirected the water toward the HOA stormwater system. 3 workers were already grading fresh dirt over the original creek bed. Beyond them, another crew was installing irrigation for the HOA's new landscaped park. I didn't shout. I took out my phone. Coordinates. Equipment numbers. Pipe diameter. Excavator tracks. Direction of flow. Then I noticed an orange survey cap sticking halfway out of the mud beneath one of their machines. I knew that marker. It identified the southwest corner of my parcel. They weren't working near my land. They were working on it. A few minutes later, Linda Caldwell walked over from the construction site. Linda was the HOA president. Clean boots. Blue folder. The kind of person who held a clipboard like it came with arrest powers. I pointed at the marker. You crossed my boundary. She barely looked down. The board approved the drainage correction. That wasn't my question. She closed the folder. This project is authorized, Daniel. Don't interfere with the contractors. Then she pointed toward my own field. If you enter the construction area again, I'll call the sheriff. So I stepped back. Not because she was right. Because at that point, I wanted every machine to keep working exactly where my camera could see it. By noon, Linda had already rewritten the story. At 12:43, an email from the HOA attorney arrived. The subject line said, "Interference with authorized stormwater improvements." According to the letter, I had entered an active construction zone, intimidated contractors, and attempted to obstruct work designed to protect 137 homes from flooding. None of that had happened. I had stood on my own land, taken photographs, and asked one question. But Linda understood something about small organizations. If you write the accusation first, people start treating it like fact. The letter ordered me to remain 50 feet from the project boundary. It also warned that further interference would be reported to the county sheriff. I read that sentence twice. The project boundary they were telling me not to cross included roughly 4/10 of an acre of my property. At 2:16, another email arrived. This one was from Linda. She described the creek diversion as a critical community safety measure. She mentioned flooding, insurance exposure, property values. Then she added one line. Your personal objections do not override community infrastructure needs. That was useful. I printed both emails. Then I went outside and photographed every construction stake I could see from my side of the fence. One was 11 feet beyond my recorded line. Another was 14 feet inside it. I measured both. Photographed both. Logged the time. Linda thought threatening me with the sheriff would make me retreat. Instead, she had just documented, in writing, that the HOA intended to keep working after I told them the land was mine. That evening, I went into the back room of my house and opened a steel filing cabinet that had belonged to my father. He bought the property in 1954. Back then, there was no subdivision, no clubhouse, no HOA. Just 11 acres, an old farmhouse, and Millstone Creek running across the western field. My father kept records the way some people keep photographs. Deeds, tax maps, survey notes, drainage sketches. Anything connected to the land went into that cabinet. 20 minutes in, I found what I was looking for. A survey dated August 1954. The paper was yellow at the folds. The ink was faded. But the boundaries were clear. So was one blue line running through the parcel. Beside it were 2 words: Millstone Creek. I laid that survey beside the photographs from that morning. The channel matched almost perfectly. Same bend near the walnut tree. Same crossing below the field. Same exit toward the eastern drainage basin. This wasn't runoff created by the subdivision. The creek had been documented decades before the subdivision existed. Then I found a county survey from 1987. Same channel. A drainage map from 2003. Same channel again. 3 different records. 3 different decades. Same creek. I scanned every page. Backed the files up twice. Then I reread Linda's email. She had called what they did a drainage correction. That wording bothered me. Because you correct something that was wrong. And every record in front of me showed that Millstone Creek had been exactly where it belonged for more than 70 years. So the next morning, I went looking for the document that supposedly gave Linda permission to move it. The county records office opened at 8. I was there at 8:07. I asked for every drainage plan, grading permit, stormwater filing, and site plan connected to the HOA park. The clerk brought out 3 folders and opened the digital archive. I spent more than 2 hours comparing dates. The park plan was there. The walking path was there. Irrigation approval. Grading plan. Landscaping. But Millstone Creek was missing. Not relocated. Not relabeled. Missing. On one drawing, the exact area where the creek had run was marked simply, Proposed Green Space. I put the 2003 drainage map beside the new park drawing. Same property line. Same contours. But the creek had vanished from the plan. I asked the clerk for the authorization, approving relocation of the channel. She searched by parcel. Nothing. By project name. Nothing. By contractor. Still nothing. Then I asked for paperwork authorizing a connection between the creek and the subdivision storm sewer. Again, nothing in the file she could locate. That didn't prove no agency anywhere had ever issued anything. But it proved one important point. The county project file Linda kept calling an authorized drainage improvement contained no obvious authorization for moving Millstone Creek. Before I left, I requested certified copies. At 10:41, Linda called. I let it ring twice. She didn't ask what I had found. She said, "Daniel, you need to stop digging into this." I wrote down the time, because people rarely tell you to stop looking when there's nothing worth finding. 2 days later, the HOA held a preview event for what Linda was calling Millstone Green. There were catered tables, architectural renderings, a banner stretched between 2 trees. Coming soon, Millstone Green. I almost laughed. They had buried Millstone Creek and then borrowed its name for the park. I arrived at 5:26 with a copy of the old survey inside a plain manila folder. Linda saw me before I reached the display boards. She was standing with 3 board members and a real estate agent, explaining how the park would increase property values. Then she looked at my boots. They were muddy from measuring the creek bed. "Daniel," she said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "some people see mud. We see property value." A few people laughed. I didn't. I looked past her at the rendering. The walking path crossed directly over the place where Millstone Creek had been less than a week earlier. No creek, no channel, no notation, just grass. That told me this wasn't a field decision. Someone had designed the project around the assumption that the creek would never come back. Then I noticed a contractor logo in the lower corner. Barton Civil and Landscape. I photographed it. Linda stepped closer. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be." "No," I said. "I'm making a record." Her expression changed. Only for a second. The next morning, I requested the project invoices. The packet arrived the following afternoon. 17 pages. Most of it was ordinary construction billing. Excavator hours. Pipe delivery. Grading. Topsoil. I read every line. Then halfway down page 17, I found this. Creek diversion and channel closure. 186 linear feet. I stopped. Read it again. Then printed 3 copies. Linda had spent the week calling the project a drainage correction, a safety improvement, routine stormwater work. But the contractor who performed the job had billed the HOA for exactly what I had been saying. Creek diversion. And they had measured it. 186 feet. I put the invoice beside the 1954 survey. The survey proved the creek existed. The invoice proved the HOA knew they were moving it. Then I noticed the date. The diversion had been approved as a change order 6 days before the excavator crossed my boundary. This wasn't a crew improvising in the field. Someone made the decision in advance. At 4:12, I emailed Barton Civil and asked for the authorization tied to that change order. I expected silence. Instead, 23 minutes later, the project manager called me. His voice was careful. He said the HOA requested the reroute because the original creek conflicted with the park layout. Then he paused. "We told them there might be additional review required." I wrote that down. "Who did you tell?" Another pause. Linda Caldwell. Now I had the question that mattered. Not whether Linda knew they moved the creek. She did. The question was whether she had been warned before they did it. And if that warning existed in writing, the entire story changed. That night, I stopped treating the problem like a neighborhood dispute. I treated it like an engineering failure. I opened a new binder. Tab 1, the 1954 survey. Tab 2, the 1987 county survey. Tab 3, the 2003 drainage map. Tab 4, photographs of the original creek bed. Tab 5, photographs of the 30-inch pipe. Tab 6, Linda's emails describing the work as authorized. Tab 7, the contractor invoice. Then I added measurements. 186 feet of channel filled. 2 boundary stakes inside the construction area. 1 new connection, carrying creek water toward the subdivision drainage system. And 1 contractor who had already admitted Linda was warned that additional review might be required. I didn't send Linda another message. There was no reason to. At 9:14 the next morning, I submitted a documentation package for federal review. Maps, coordinates, photographs, construction records, no accusations, no speech, just evidence. 3 days passed. Then 5. Linda kept the crews moving. The walking path was poured. Landscapers covered parts of the old creek bed with sod. Families were already taking pictures beside the new gazebo. Then, at 3:37 on Friday afternoon, my phone rang. The man on the other end asked me to confirm the location of the original channel. Then he asked if the excavation was still active. Yes. A pause. "We need to see the site." Monday morning, 2 government vehicles arrived. Linda came out of the clubhouse smiling. She thought they were county inspectors. Then she read the lettering on the first vehicle. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. For the first time since this started, Linda Caldwell stopped talking. The Corps team didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. 1 inspector asked to walk the original channel. I took them to the western boundary. The old creek bed was still visible beneath the new fill if you knew what to look for. Different vegetation, dark sediment, a shallow depression, fresh soil over the top. They photographed everything. Then we followed the new trench toward the subdivision. At the storm inlet, 1 inspector crouched beside the 30-inch pipe, and watched the water disappear into concrete. Was this connection here before the park project? No. He wrote it down. By then, Linda had arrived with 2 board members and Barton's project manager. She carried the same blue folder. This was an approved stormwater improvement, she said. The county reviewed the park. The inspector didn't argue. He looked at Barton's project manager. Who authorized the channel relocation? The manager looked at Linda. The HOA requested the change. Linda nodded. The board approved it. The inspector looked up. I'm not asking who voted for it. He pointed toward the filled creek bed. I'm asking what authorization you relied on to fill this area and divert this channel. Nobody answered. Linda opened her folder. Park approval, grading plan, county correspondence. The inspector read each document, slowly, then handed them back. None of these appears to authorize what I'm looking at. Linda's voice changed. This is just a drainage ditch. I opened my binder to page 17, handed over the invoice. The inspector read the line aloud. Creek diversion and channel closure, 186 linear feet. He looked at Barton's project manager. Is that your invoice? Yes. Is that an accurate description of the work? The manager hesitated, then nodded. Yes. The inspector closed his notebook. No additional work in this area until the review is complete. For 8 days, Linda had told me I was interfering with an authorized project. Now the project was stopped, but the shutdown wasn't what worried her most. Before the Corps left, they asked Barton for every email, drawing, change order, and warning connected to the diversion. And one of those emails had Linda Caldwell's name on it. Linda didn't apologize. That afternoon, she called an emergency board meeting and told residents the Corps had stopped construction over a technical permitting question. By 6 o'clock, an HOA-wide email went out. It blamed me by name. According to Linda, one outside landowner had used federal bureaucracy to delay a safety project protecting 137 homes. She said the board acted in good faith. She said no one had ever told them additional review was needed. That last sentence survived less than 24 hours. The next morning, Barton Civil produced its correspondence. 43 emails. I read every one. Most were routine. Scheduling, materials, concrete deliveries. Then I reached an email dated 11 days before the excavation. The subject line was, Millstone Channel Conflict, Review Required. Barton's project manager wrote that the existing creek crossed the park layout and that relocating it could require additional regulatory review before construction proceeded. He recommended pausing the diversion. Linda replied 7 minutes later. 3 sentences. The last one mattered. Proceed with the reroute. We cannot lose the construction window. I printed it. Then checked the dates. 6 days later, the HOA approved payment for the diversion. 5 days after that, the excavator entered my property. There was no ambiguity left. Linda had been warned before the work started. She didn't misunderstand the warning. She overruled it. That afternoon, additional engineering information was requested. Pre-construction channel conditions. The new stormwater connection. Site elevations. The HOA attorney stopped copying Linda on some project correspondence. The board treasurer requested an independent cost estimate. Then Linda sent me one final message. You have no idea what this is going to cost everyone. She was right about one thing. I didn't. Not yet. 3 days later, an engineering firm put the first restoration estimate on the table. 42 pages. Linda looked at the last one. $397,600. The estimate was broken down line by line. Hydraulic analysis. Excavation. Reopening 186 feet of channel. Reworking the drainage connection. Bank stabilization. Erosion control. Native vegetation. Engineering supervision. Monitoring. Linda stared at the number. $400,000 for a ditch? Nobody answered. I opened my binder. Page 17. You called it a ditch. I slid the invoice across the table. Your contractor called it a creek diversion. The treasurer picked up the invoice, then asked a question Linda hadn't prepared for. How much have we already spent on the park? The answer was $186,240. So the HOA had spent more than $186,000 building a park around a creek they buried. Now they were looking at almost $400,000 to restore it. And that still didn't include legal costs, redesign, or whatever happened to the finished walking path once the channel came back. For the first time, the board stopped talking about me. They started talking about Linda. Who approved the change order? Who ignored Barton's warning? Who told residents everything was authorized? Linda pushed back. This was a board decision. The treasurer shook his head. No, the board approved a park. He held up her email. You approved the reroute. That was when Linda realized the worst number in the room wasn't $397,600. It was 7 minutes. That was how long it took her to receive a written warning and tell the contractor to proceed anyway. By the next morning, 63 homeowners had signed a petition demanding an emergency meeting. The meeting started at 7 on Thursday night. By 6:40, every chair in the community center was taken. People stood against the walls. 63 signatures had become 81. Linda sat at the center of the board table, blue folder in front of her. No smile. The treasurer opened with the numbers. Park spending, $186,240. Current restoration estimate, $397,600. Legal and redesign costs, still unknown. Someone in the second row said, So we paid almost $200,000 to build this, and now we may pay another $400,000 to tear part of it back out? Nobody corrected him. Linda leaned into the microphone. This situation exists because Mr. Mercer escalated a private drainage disagreement into a federal matter. A woman near the front stood up. Did Daniel move the creek? Linda didn't answer. Did Daniel hire the excavator? Nothing. Did Daniel approve the change order? Silence. Linda said the board relied on professional contractors and acted in the best interests of the community. That was when Barton's project manager stood up from the back row. He had his own folder. Our firm advised the HOA in writing that relocating the channel could require additional review. Linda turned toward him. We discussed several options. Yes, he said. And our recommendation was to pause. The treasurer projected the email onto the wall. Everyone could read it. Millstone Channel conflict. Review required. Then Linda's reply appeared below it. Proceed with the reroute. We cannot lose the construction window. 7 minutes. No interpretation required. A man near the aisle asked, Did the board vote on that decision? The secretary checked the minutes. No. Another homeowner asked, Were we told there was a creek under the park? Again, no. Then someone asked the question that ended Linda's version of events. If this was properly authorized, why are we paying almost $400,000 to put it back? Nobody at the board table answered. I had been sitting in the last row. I hadn't planned to speak. Then Linda looked directly at me. You've made your point, Daniel. I stood up, walked to the front carrying one sheet of paper. Not the invoice, not the estimate. The 1954 survey. I placed it on the table. The paper was more than 70 years old. The blue line was still there. This creek was here before the subdivision. I pointed to the channel. Before the clubhouse. Then I looked at Linda. Before this HOA existed. Nobody spoke. It'll be here after you're gone. I went back to my seat. That was all I said. The board voted that night to suspend Linda's authority over the project and begin an independent review. She left before the meeting ended. No speech, no blue folder. 2 days later, every homeowner received a short email. Linda Caldwell had resigned as HOA president, effective immediately. But resignation didn't put the water back. That required excavators. 3 weeks later, they returned to the exact place where the story started. Same entrance, same field, same stretch of ground. But this time, they weren't there to bury Millstone Creek. They were there to restore it. The crew started at the western boundary. They removed the fill packed into the original channel, section by section. Then they reworked the diversion that had been carrying the creek toward the HOA storm system. The engineers marked the historic alignment using the surveys, county records, and field elevations. The line was almost exactly where my father's 1954 map said it would be. By the third day, the old creek was visible again. The bend near the walnut tree, the shallow crossing below the field, the outlet toward the eastern drainage basin. Nothing dramatic happened when the water came back. No television cameras, no speeches. The crew removed the final temporary barrier at 10:32 that morning. Water moved into the restored channel slowly. Then it found the grade. Within minutes, Millstone Creek was flowing across my property again. I stood there and watched it. More than 70 years after my father's survey was drawn, the blue line on that paper matched the water in front of me. The park didn't disappear completely. It had to be redesigned. Part of the walking path was removed. The landscaping near the creek was replaced with native vegetation. The drainage system was modified. New erosion controls went in, and the section Linda wanted covered with perfect grass became a restored creek corridor instead. The final restoration work came in close to the original estimate. By then, nobody in the neighborhood called Millstone Creek a ditch. The HOA elected a new president. 2 board members were replaced. They adopted new procedures requiring independent boundary and permit verification before major construction projects. Project documents had to be available before large amounts of money were committed. No single officer could push through a change like the creek reroute again. I never joined the HOA. I didn't want a board seat. I didn't ask them to name anything after me. I wanted the property line respected, and I wanted the water put back where it belonged. A few months later, I repaired the old wooden footbridge near the walnut tree. My father had built the first version when I was a kid. The new one wasn't impressive. Pressure-treated lumber, galvanized bolts, 4 concrete footings. It did the job. Sometimes I stand there in the morning and look downstream toward the subdivision. You can still see part of the redesigned park through the trees. Linda wanted that park to be the project everyone remembered her for. In a way, it was. Just not for the reason she expected. She buried a creek to improve property values, ignored a written warning to protect a construction schedule, and turned a $186,000 park into nearly $400,000 worth of restoration work. All because she believed an HOA approval could erase a line that had been sitting on recorded maps for more than 70 years. It couldn't. Paperwork doesn't look powerful. Neither does an old survey folded inside a steel filing cabinet. But sometimes the quietest document in the room decides who owns the ground beneath everyone's feet. And Millstone Creek? It's still running. If you believe property rights should mean more than a title on someone's clipboard, subscribe. Because this was never just about a creek. It was about what happens when someone mistakes authority for ownership and discovers that records, boundaries, and the law were there long before they were.